Good morning, everyone. Well, greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia, and I am going to talk to you about the my paper, which is about opium farming system and bureaucratic malaise in late Spanish Philippines. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the 1896 Iloilo inspection report. Now, before I proceed, let me just outline my discussion as follows. The goal of my analysis is to analyze the 1896 findings and situate it within the larger context of the privately run opium revenue farming system in late Spanish Philippines. I argue that although the opium farm was usually a lucrative venture for contractors, a contributing factor in its success as a business venture lay in the support of or the wide latitude given by the government. The goal of this analysis, therefore, uh, is to obtain a better understanding of the nature of the relationship between opium regulation and the exercise of imperial power. In this case, the clash of official views reflected the flexible approach taken towards the consumption of a substance that assured a steady revenue stream in the dying days of Spain's Pacific Empire. Now, let me just talk about the outline. I'll be talking about the brief history of the regime, opium regime, and the emergence of the farm in Iloilo, and the people involved in the inspection reports, the contents of the reports, and some of the conclusions. To understand this relationship and how it relates to the report, it is necessary to define a few terms. Adopting the definition of regime as used by historians Brook and Wakabayashi, a regime is defined as a system in which an authority declares its right to control certain practices and develops policies and mechanisms to exercise that right within its presumed domain. By imposing conformity to policies that are profitable to it in the public realm, it allows one to highlight the systematic and comprehensive character of drug control structures and to stress their capacity for operating in the political realm. Um, an opium revenue farm is a largely private revenue collecting institution. These regimes auctioned off the exclusive right to private individuals or groups to import, process, and sell opium at retail within a designated territory for a set term. From the state's viewpoint, the primary motive was not to curb nor limit opium use, but rather to provide colonies with a revenue stream to support its state building projects. Um, Opium farming best served, therefore, governments that lacked revenue, manpower, and local knowledge, but it also lacked accountability and placed a great deal of political and economic power outside the direct control of the state, to quote Daniel Wirtz. Now, in the Philippines, the opium farm was limited only to the ethnic Chinese. And this was particularly popular in the second half of the 19th century, coinciding with the um, turnabout by the Spanish colonial government by adopting economic policies supposed to be developed and make the colony profitable. Thus, the Chinese population in the Philippines surged from just 5,700 in 1847 to around 90,000 within the period of 1876 to 1886. Now, Southeast opium in Southeast Asia has been around, but the introduction of tobacco in the area transformed its use, and therefore opium smoking began. At first, it existed in the form of a tobacco opium herbal blend, and it was called in the Southeast Asian region, particularly the Malay Peninsula, as madak or madat. Um, the Chinese also called opium for smoking as yapyan. However, by the 18th century, with the invention of the opium pipe and the disappearance and the switch to pure opium smoking, it was called chandu, or it was called chandu in Southeast Asia, and in the Philippines it was called apian in Tagalog, or opio cocido or opio preparado in Spanish. Although in generic terms it was called anfion. Now, opium was valued by the Chinese as a form of medicine. It was an aphrodisiac. It became a distraction for the migrant consumer. as a way of deadening pain, so it was a work drug, and enabled them to cope with personal vicissitudes such as homesickness and the need for camaraderie or the need of sex. Therefore, opium met a very real and psychic needs of the users. Now, let me just go over some of the general turning points or timelines in the creation of the opium regime. In 1814, we first see the first policy, written policy, with the banning of opium use by Governor General Jose Gardoqui. However, 30 years later, there was an about face, and finally the government allowed the introduction of opium farming in the Philippines, provided that it was only limited to the Chinese. 6 years later, it went beyond Manila, and it now covered provinces outside of Manila, and it does pave the way for its expansion for the next 30 to 40 years. In 1864, there was a policy review because a debate raged over the adverse health and social effects of opium smoking. Now, the review panel resolved to retain the opium farm system and the ban on the non-Chinese users. Now, since there was no contrary medical evidence, the council argued that to reimpose a total ban would run counter to its economic goals. Now, to quote from the decision, let me just mention this. The Chinese have certainly come to our archipelago in the expectation that they would be allowed to smoke opium here. Were we to suddenly ban opium, as had been done in the past, when we punish the Chinese with fines and imprisonment, most of the Chinese living in Manila would be in jail or altogether abandon the islands. It would not be right and unjust, and we should certainly not allow it to happen. At the present, such a policy is inappropriate and politically unwise. We want to enter into agreements with China and facilitate trade. What would the Chinese government say if we dealt with their subjects this way? For the treasury, the opium revenue is indispensable. And it was. The opium revenue became an integral part of the colony's finances and kept it financially solvent. A high point of the share of revenues generated was reached in 1894 when it comprised 4.4% of the total collections. However, it paled in comparison with the cases of the Netherlands East Indies or Indonesia, which had 35% of its revenues, or even Singapore, which had 59% of its revenues. Even its closest cousin, British Burma, averaged around 8.5% of its collections between 1861 to 1885. So therefore, the Spanish government was not beholden totally to opium revenues. Now, the regulation of the opium regime was managed by the government agency called the Intendencia General. It auctioned off to private entrepreneurs the operation of opium smoking houses within a province or a block of territories, usually for a 3-year period. The vast powers vested by the government to these individuals also came with assumed risks, which is why it required a substantial mobilization of capital to organize and implement. Opium dens were to be opened exclusively for Chinese patrons, and identifying signs in Chinese and Spanish characters had to be put up. Chinese were not allowed to smoke at home. Now, despite this, there was the observation that despite the fact that there were still hundreds of that Chinese individuals who bringing opium to their homes for consumptions, because the dens were always filled with Chinese. Now, we have yet to construct the full extent of the number of smoking houses, but can we say based on the prevailing evidence, Zamboanga Farm had 7 dens in 1870, Albay had 61, Cagayan Isabela Farm had 40, while 56 of the 100 dens were located in Iloilo town proper itself in 1896. Which brings us to the emergence of the opium farm in Iloilo. Iloilo province traditionally formed part of a node of commercial activity in the Visayan region, linking China with Sulu and the Moluccas, and in the 18th century, there was a shift from the shipbuilding industry to local textile production. When Iloilo was open to foreign commerce in 1855, it transformed the life in the region. A new wave of Chinese immigration entered Iloilo City after 1855. From 32 in 1857, there were now 1,995 Chinese adult males in 1895. In short, the economic policies that had the effect of creating the surge in Chinese presence in Iloilo provided the demand for opium. Sometime during the late 1860s, an Islas Visayas opium farm was already in existence and covered the provinces of Iloilo, Antique, and Cebu. The contractor was the merchant Don Ignacio Rocha, who owned Rocha and Company and was a member of the Comité de Reformadores. The Cebu farm seemed to have been detached in the 1870s, leaving Iloilo and Antique as a single farm. Further research confirming the chain of ownership of the farm still needs to be done, but here's what we can come up with. Some of the farmers that are based on the records were Tanhanco, Sebastian Yaptamco, Don Jose Enrique Yaphoco, and Ong Kausay. We will talk about more about that Yaphoco's term because this is where the report came out, when the report came out. We do know little about Yaphoco, but he appears to be a partner or an agent of one Francisco M. Yaptico, who ran a hemp and sugar exporting firm based in Iloilo. Him we do know more. He appears to have established a substantial presence in Iloilo due to the expanse of his business interests in the 1880s and 1890s that even Alfred McCoy credits him as the only one who was equal in stature to the major European or mestizo merchants. He later expanded operations to Manila and Cebu and became a rice importer as well. He may have been one of the four persons who in 1886 petitioned the Chinese that a Chinese consulate be established in the Philippines. While it could be suggested that running the opium farm was Yaphoco's separate investment from that of Tantico, it would be highly unlikely given Tantico's economic clout, as Yaphoco and Tantico were part of the company, and given the capital requirements of managing a territory, it is more likely to conclude that Tantico's farm was connected in exercising control of the farms through the 1890s. We do have an idea of how substantial the Iloilo Antique farm was. The Iloilo farm was estimated to generate around 30,000 pesos annually and when Ong Kausay obtained the contract in 1896, the value of the contract was already at 117,325 pesos. Compared to that with one of the more lucrative provincial farms, the Cagayan Isabela contract, in comparison, was only worth like 81,200 pesos. Now, the Iloilo Antique farm had 100 licensed opium dens. Of these, 98 were in Iloilo province, while only the towns of Antique and Tibiao had one each in Antique. In Iloilo, the highest concentration was in Iloilo town proper, followed by Haro and Molo. In Iloilo town proper, around half or 26 of them were located along Real Street, where Chinatown is currently located. Although the number of opium users in 1896 could not be established, in 1903 report gives us an indication of the extent. One report estimates around 1/3 or 658 were opium users based in the same three towns. Now, if one only uses the figures where the towns in 1896 had opium with the 1903 Chinese user population and apply the value of Ong Kausay's contract, well, one rough estimate would put an average user in Iloilo to be spending around 4 pesos per consumer per month. Now, who were the major personalities of the report? Well, the dossier is composed of inspection reports conducted by two groups of Intendencia functionaries, and there were two visitations. First one was done by Julio Martinez de Velasco in May 1896, and the second one was conducted by Amaro Lopez in August 1896. Julio Martinez de Velasco was part of the inspection and investigation section of the Intendencia. while Amaro Lopez was an oficial segunda grado de administración connected with the Ordenación de Pagos or Disbursement Office. And in the 1896 report, he was called Secretario de la Inspección of Inter Iloilo Province. Now, they were accompanied by their respective secretaries or clerks, who were Numeriano Alejo and Gavino Sepulveda. With Sepulveda, it is unknown whether he was the actual person who became a Cebuano revolutionary in the 1890s. Another official who signed off was Benito Perdiguero, who was again connected with the Intendencia, but he was more popularly associated with being the archivist librarian of the Museo Biblioteca de Filipinas from 1890 to 1895, which was the forerunner of the Philippine National Library. Venancio Concepcion, the lawyer representing Yap Hoko, was later appointed as a representative for Iloilo in the Maglolos Congress. And he became a general and fought in the Philippine-American War and was appointed president later of the Philippine National Bank. Now, let's go to the report's findings. Well, the reports do not explain the reason why the inspection was undertaken, and it does not appear to be a pro forma practice, aside from the fact that in the standardized contracts around the time, the contractor was required to provide a list of licensed den operators and their addresses. Clause 19 also required signs in both Spanish and English languages designating the opium dens to be displayed conspicuously. Now, the first round, now let's proceed to the general findings. Now, both teams found the following. Number one, some dens were located at back rooms or private areas of certain shops. Meaning, if they were located in the back rooms, they were not openly publicized as public opium dens. Another problem that arose was that most of the visited premises did not have the matching license numbers provided by the contractor, which it was explained that there was a mix-up in the documentation. Some proprietors of the dens were unavailable, and they were busy in Manila. And there was a lack of compliance regarding the designation of dens with the type of mandatory bilingual signage as described in Clause 19 of the contract. Now, one explanation was that they were not obliged to, given the fact that some of them were private, and then the Chinese were actually more interested in getting their opium rather than reading the Spanish language. Now, Amaro Lopez had more revelations. It turned out that Yap Hoko granted numerous concessions to individuals that enabled them to smoke privately or at home, despite the fact that no such right was provided by the contract. Moreover, such dens were never made known to the public. Now, when they tried to interview the proprietors, Lopez was told that the private users did not pay extra for the concession, but paid only for the cost of opium directly obtained from the contractor. Therefore, Concepcion claimed, in defense of the farmer, that private or smoke-at-home arrangement were almost customary in Iloilo, and not only in Iloilo, it was also practiced in Manila and in the other provinces. Therefore, as a result of the rather surprising revelations, these recommendations were then forwarded to the Intendencia for consideration by the Governor General. And the official that drafted the summary made the following recommendations. It believed that Yap Hoko should be made accountable for these violations because they did not allow Chinese to smoke at home. Number two, the corresponding penalty to be imposed was, however, unclear. Therefore, they needed some clarification as to how to make Yap Hoko accountable. Now, on the other hand, when this was forwarded to the tax section for consideration, meaning it was Perdiguero who made his own comments, this is what he said. Well, Since the penalty for violating the smoke at home rule was not clear, therefore, no penalty cannot be applied to Yaphoko. Why? Because if one were to think of it, the opium was obtained legally, and therefore it was not contraband opium, and therefore it was not fundamentally detrimental to the state's economic interests. The Yaphoko also supplied these persons whom he knew and were of good conduct. Therefore, nothing was the supply was not even illegal. And according to him, accommodation of the wealthy Chinese was a better way of doing it because they simply had the money, and because smoking opium was very, very expensive back then. It was thought that it cost a single dose was worth around half a peseta, and therefore you needed a number of hits to get high. Therefore, the people who can afford it, the wealthy Chinese, should have been given or would have been given a certain type of latitude, and it was better for the treasury revenue-wise. Of course, some of these Chinese preferred mixing in with their own kind rather than mixing in with the public through meeting with the lower classes of Chinese. Therefore, he made this recommendation to remove the formal ban of opium being smoked at home, since it was being practiced anyway throughout the colony. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what came out of it, but it did not matter because the policy was not changed. Plus, in 1898, Spanish rule ended once and for all. So therefore, what are my conclusions here? The Iloilo inspection reports reflect the tenuous hold the Spanish opium regime had on the contractor. The regime tolerated the policy of allowing affluent Chinese persons to smoke opium privately at back rooms of shops that doubled as residences, despite the fact that it was prohibited by the contract terms. Number of reasons justify this toleration. The lack of policy provided a more comfortable ambiance for the affluent consumers. Okay, and that the arrangement became a fight to comply in Manila and all other provinces. The officials' non-awareness of deviations from policy, such as the failure to put up mandatory bilingual signage, mix-ups in the contractors list, privatization of opium dens, and even trying to find out whether the contractor charged a fee for the concession, were signs of the farmers' depth and breadth of local control. In the colonial state's attempt to control the bodies of its opium users by requiring that dens be made public and identifiable to the state's enforcement institutions, some proprietors justified their non-compliance by claiming that their clientele cared more about where to access the drug through the Chinese language rather than the imperial language of Spanish. Okay. At the end of the day, the Spanish opium regime ended up renegotiating its power and influence with the farmer. So thank you very much and have a pleasant day.